Hassam, welcome to Let the Quran Speak.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, Hassam, what's the earliest date in the census that Muslims were found in Canada?
So the earliest date in the census, and the census records were taken later on, but the date that was identified was 1851, when there was a young Scottish couple that had arrived as Scottish immigrants, settled somewhere in southern Ontario, and later on in the census they identified themselves as Mohammedans, which was, I guess, sort of the mainstay term used to describe Muslims at the time. And of course, it's important to acknowledge all of the history that is potentially not recorded in the census, including some particular stories that we know of going back even into the late 1700s.
Okay, so can you tell us some stories of individuals who came then?
So I think it can be a bit of a tricky field to navigate because the history is patchy and it's not always very clear. And we know of people who were from Muslim backgrounds or of Muslim background, and historians speculate that they may have been Muslim, but there's no real confirmation, as in they wrote it down in a census or something like that. But Richard Pierpoint is an example. He was brought to the United States through the transatlantic slave trade from Bundu in Senegal in 1760, and he took part in the American Revolutionary War and took the British deal that was offered, which is essentially fight for the British against the American revolutionaries and you get your freedom. And him taking that deal brought him into Canada, and he's one of the early settlers in St. Catharines, Ontario, in Fergus, Ontario. And he has a very rich and fascinating story. And so that can be read online, and there's a book on it as well called A Stolen Life. And then Muhammad Bakwakwa, and you can see from the name there that he was also brought through the transatlantic slave trade, and he essentially took the decision to keep his name, which is very fascinating because they would be forced, the enslaved, to convert to Christianity, but often they maintained their faith in secret. And the fact that he kept his name Muhammad, which is just a pronunciation of Muhammad, is a strong indication that he probably maintained his faith. And in 1854, he was here as well in Chatham, Ontario. He lived there for 1 year and made a very inspiring contribution in the sense that having so many of the years of his life forcibly taken away from him and trying to go home to West Africa, he took an additional year of his life to actually stay in Chatham, where he had his story written down, which became his autobiography. It was published in the United States, and it played a role in helping abolish the slave trade in the United States.
It's interesting because when people think of Muslims in Canada, they often think of Muslims as recent immigrants coming, very recently. And now you're telling me that these individuals came even before Canada really existed, before the British North America Act, before the Confederation was formed in 1867. There were Muslims in Canada.
Absolutely, and those are the stories that we know of, right? And which is why it's very promising to share these stories, because it hopefully inspires us, especially scholars and researchers, to see what else can we find and sort of start looking in this direction. And we don't know what else we might uncover.
What are some of the important contributions that Muslims in very early times made to their societies?
So once we start to get chain migration and the first communities forming, and particularly chain migration from the Middle East, and to some extent from South Asia. And that's around the turn of the century, so coming into the early 1900s, which is still over a century ago, which is quite remarkable. You start to see contributions to society in general. And this is one of the fascinating kind of aspects, that the early Muslim contributions weren't just for the Muslim community, because there was hardly a Muslim community to speak of. These are very early migrants. So in terms of establishing businesses, being entrepreneurial in places like Alberta, in Lac La Biche, Alberta, in Edmonton later on, even far up into the Northwest Territories, and a lot of activism, I think, and this is something that is sometimes not known as well as it should be, that the amount of standing up for what the Muslims, the early Muslim settlers believed was right, not just for themselves, but also on behalf of others. So challenging the monopoly of the Hudson's Bay Company in the fur trade, challenging the government in a court case in the Komagata Maru incident in Vancouver.
Who is this?
Sorry?
Who did this?
I can give you a few names. So there's a person named Peter Baker, whose actual name was Ahmed Ali Farran, but he changed his name to sort of fit into society at the time, and he spent years far in the north, in what is now Nunavut, as a fur trader, challenging, along with other Arab, Muslim, as well as Jewish settlers, the Hudson Bay Company's monopoly on the fur trade, which was very exploitative of indigenous people. So these alternative customers and fur traders enabled the indigenous people to have some choice in terms of getting a better deal for themselves. And of course, this is a very complex topic, and it also reminds us that at the same time, Muslims since the beginning have played a role in the sort of the settler colonialist project as well. And we have to be very mindful of that and what that means about our role in Canadian society today. And the second example that I had mentioned in the Komagata Maru incident in Vancouver, when political refugees from India, British ruled India, had arrived, and they were turned away by the Canadian government and sent back to India. But there's one particular person named Hussein Rahim who had come from India earlier on and settled in Vancouver, and he worked with the very early Sikh and Hindu communities in Vancouver to actually fight the government and challenge the government's decision to not let these refugees into Canada. And he was also what you might call Canada's first known journalist, because he started a journal in Vancouver in 1914, I believe. And many other stories related even to these individuals, and it's remarkable how much detail we have available. And one of my favorite about Hussein Rahim is that because he was of Indian descent, there was a law at the time that didn't allow him to vote in Canada. So at one time he was arrested in Vancouver, and he was accused of voting in the election. Right? And this is something that you could be accused of in Canada. And so, but it couldn't be proven. And really there's records, there's government records of all of these stories and many others about how active the Muslims were in really changing the status quo. And they had been brought and they had been invited to come to Canada and encouraged because they were told it was a land of opportunity. And the Canadian government really promoted this, but they created opportunities of their own as well in ways that perhaps wasn't expected. And I think they played a very important role in making Canada a better place gradually.
It's amazing when you think of what they've achieved, because, on the other hand, you can imagine all of the racism and discrimination and all of the barriers that might have been put in place at that time. Now we have a very open society compared to back then. Right. You can imagine the struggles that they might have had to overcome.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to remember that there's many such incidents of that as well. The first known Muslim in Toronto, Rajib Asim, couldn't find a job because he was Albanian, but he was considered a Turk when he arrived in 1912, and very soon afterwards, World War I broke out. And I remember there's a sign that was posted across or in certain places in Toronto that listed certain ethnicities, Germans, Austrians, Hungarians, and Turks, and there's an address on Adelaide Street in downtown Toronto where they were told to come and register themselves as enemy aliens because they were their countries of origin were places that were on the opposite side in World War I, as Canada was. And the famous example of the Brantford Turks, which I encourage people to really look up and read about, is there was internment of Muslims in Canada, and they were interned in camps far up north in northern Ontario, which is where you would put a camp.
Not a lot of people know about that.
Not a lot of people know about that. And these are the kind of stories that I think it's important for us to learn and for us to share among ourselves.
Did Muslims fight in the world wars?
Yes, they did. So particularly for World War I so far, in my research, I've been able to find specific records. We know that 22 known Muslims or people of Muslim background fought for Canada in World War I. And one of them, he was from Singapore. He was a Malay Canadian, and he fought at the Battle of Vimy Ridge, which is sort of important in the sense that we have this notion that's taught that Canada was born on the slopes of Vimy Ridge. The national character of Canada was built in that conflict. And he actually died in the Battle of Hill 70 in France, and he was buried in France while fighting for Canada. So there was that contribution as well. And so you have these both sides of the story of Muslims being interned and Muslims serving for Canada, and really points to the fact that we have been here. Even in World War I was more than 100 years ago.
And we participated in life in Canadian society.
Yeah.
So Hassam, tell me, when was the first Muslim Canadian elected into political office?
So that was in 1963, and that was actually Peter Baker, who I mentioned earlier as well. So Peter Baker facing, a lot of discrimination up north, and it's really interesting because at the time when Islamophobia wasn't necessarily a thing and people weren't very familiar with Islam, what Peter Baker would be accused of often by his detractors and competitors and others, and rumors would be spread about him, was that he was a Jew. And at the time in the place, so we have a Muslim essentially facing anti-Semitism because that was the sort of
because they didn't have another term.
Yeah, that was sort of the go-to form of bigotry for people who wanted to be bigoted at the time, and in that place. So
But he got elected nonetheless.
And he got elected in 1963. So later on, and from an indigenous majority riding of Mackenzie North in what is now Nunavut, he was elected to the Legislative Assembly of what was at the time just Northwest Territories. And he was in office for 4 years, from 1963 to 1967. And it's said, although I haven't been able to confirm it yet, that he was actually the person who tabled the motion to have Whitehorse declared the capital of Northwest Territories. So that might be an interesting contribution as well, if we can confirm it.
Hassam, why do you think that we don't know enough about these stories today?
I think the information is not very accessible. It does take a lot of digging. It does take a lot of, slow, painstaking kind of piecing together of bits and pieces of information. I'm often asked, is there a book I can read, or is there like a documentary I can watch? And really, there is nothing that gives a holistic view, especially of some of these early stories, right? Later on, of course, once the open door immigration policy happened in the 1960s, and with the influx of Muslim immigrants and the sudden growth of communities, and we have much more detailed records, not to mention that many of those early pioneers, in a sense, are still with us in our communities, and we can speak to them and learn directly from them. But hopefully, moving forward, resources will develop. And really, I think what's important is when somebody does chance upon, like the discussion we're having now, or elsewhere, they see some discussion on the history of Muslims in Canada, to not just scroll by and to maybe take a moment, read through it, share it with others, and that's how slowly we build our own awareness, and then we're able to share with others.
Hassam, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.